All right, so my projects that I'm going to be talking about are naturally NISO projects, since I work at NISO and I work with these two initiatives pretty closely. Both of these projects, I'm talking about KBART first and PyJ, a little bit of PyJ at the end. They're acronyms, and I'll be explaining what the acronyms mean. Hopefully, I mean, the projects hope that having the acronyms help you to remember them a little bit better. They are a little related. They're both involved with journals, so if you're a journal publisher, I hope that both of these initiatives will help you communicate information about your products to libraries. Both of these projects are in, we call them at NISO standing committee mode. That means that they've published their recommendations in each case several years ago, and there are groups now who are responsible for providing education about them, creating additional tools for them, talking about them like I'm talking about these two initiatives today, and answering questions about them. So if you have any questions about these, there are places that you can go with the experts who are working to communicate them. So KBART stands for Knowledge Bases and Related Tools. And in essence, it manages coverage of journals. So if you're a publisher and you publish a suite of journals, KBART is a good way for you to communicate the coverage information to library customers for use in their link resolvers so that their users can access that information and connect to the journals that they're licensing from you. Or to the electronic resources librarian who's managing his or her collection of titles so that the library knows what it is they are subscribing to. And this needs to be generally updated as coverage changes. PyJ, on the other hand, stands for Presentation and Identification of eJournals, and it's also related to eJournals, but in a slightly different way. It's generally more public-facing. It provides recommendations on how a publisher should present the company's journals on its web pages, what kinds of information, metadata should be included there to help users navigate around the website and access the titles that they're trying to find, perhaps from a citation that might have been printed years before. So these are the two ends. KBART more on the back end, PyJ more on the front end. And now I'm going to be going into KBART in a little bit more detail. So KBART, as I mentioned, it's knowledge bases and related tools, and it's a recommended practice from NISO. Not to get too far into the weeds, but recommended practices are a little bit of a more lightweight document than a NISO standard. Recommended practices can be implemented in whole or in part, and there's a little bit more leeway about those things. It's recommendations. It's not something that you have to adhere to as a full standard. The first part of KBART was completed quite some time ago in 2010 and focused on serial titles. There was a phase 2 of KBART, which was completed a few years ago, which updated KBART to include e-books and series. So if you publish something like proceedings, which may be published as both a monograph and a series, that's KBART phase 2 explained how you could express the description of that information in this KBART format. And I will be saying a few words about the new KBART automation project that Heather mentioned in the counter presentation and talking about how those things two things relate to each other. So a little bit on the discovery and delivery landscape, and this is a little bit of involved image, and I didn't put animation on it because I wasn't sure what the capabilities would be here at the session. And I'm going to talk, I'm assuming if I'm talking you can hear me just fine if I'm not standing for the microphone. So we've got users who are accessing content through databases, websites, discovery things.
I think it's being recorded.
Oh, okay. I'll use the little arrow. All right. So you've got users on the left-hand side, and they're accessing stuff. And then behind the scenes, you've got content providers, so journal publishers, database providers, et cetera, who give their metadata and so on in full text to the discovery providers so that users can search those tools, but they also provide the title lists and package information to a library's link resolver so the library knows what it has. So when users are trying to access, they pull up their search results and then want to access the full text, users will typically transmit metadata through an open URL, a tool, another NISO standard, to a link resolver, which will then link them to the full text that they're trying to access. Institutions customize the link resolver using holdings information that they get through entitlement lists from their providers. So we've got a lot of things going on at the same time, but when all is working as it should, hopefully users are accessing the information through their search results and then getting to things at the end of the process. KBART is the format which helps the providers supply their journal information or monograph information to the link resolver vendors so that end users can access that information. And there's a number of data elements, which I won't go into too much detail on, but they are typical title, ISSN, identifiers for the title level information, and then issue level information. So if you are publishing the Journal of X from 1985 through 1995 with specific volumes and issues, that's the information that you'll include in your KBART file, one row per title with each of these metadata items as columns. And you'll transmit that information in a file, a text tab delimited file, to the link resolver vendor, and they will use that information to supply their product to the library. There's an additional, the other columns that you see toward the end, those were added in KBART Phase 2, and you can see by looking at them, they're monograph types of information for books. The Standing Committee, which is responsible for providing education on KBART and answering questions about KBART, also in providing certification to KBART users. So publishers will adopt KBART and send a sample file to the Standing Committee, which then checks it to make sure that it's accurately communicating information in the KBART format, and then publishers can tell their customers we are sending certified KBART files. The Standing Committee consists of a number of different types of participants, like all NISO committees. There are representatives from content providers, knowledge-based vendors, and several types of libraries. We've got a few consortia providers, some UK librarians, a French librarian has joined. So all of these people together are cooperating to make sure that KBART works for all of the different audiences who are using it. What the group is doing now is specifically working on targeted outreach to content providers. They want to make sure that everyone who should be using KBART is using it, and trying to get more endorsements from more publishers to make sure that it's adopted and that publishers' requirements are met in KBART. There were also a number of providers who endorsed Phase 1, which I mentioned, and Phase 2 added some more things, so the group is determining how to re-endorse publishers from Phase 1 to Phase 2, and also spending a lot of time to develop materials to make it easier to implement KBART. In particular, they've worked on some pretty significant education programs and presented pre-conferences at Charleston and NASIG last year, and got a lot of feedback from providers about how those tools were working. They've also been working with other NISO groups, such as the Open Discovery Initiative, which isn't something I'm going to be talking about today, but making sure that the requirements are harmonized across these projects. One comment that we hear a lot from publishers and providers, and this is partly one of the reasons for having this presentation today, is that all of these standards present a lot of requirements. How does a publisher know what kinds of things they should be paying attention to and which kinds of things they can, kind of kill two birds with one stone? So that's another reason for the NISO groups to work together to make it easier to present a united front to help adoption of all of these standards that we're discussing today. So to move to the next project, the KBART automation one, I'm going to bring back this landscape slide again. And I mentioned earlier I was talking about users discovering things, content providers sending metadata to the discovery engines, and title lists to the knowledge base. Meanwhile, the library has to update the knowledge base with lists of their subscriptions, which they get typically, possibly via email, from the content provider. So we've got a situation where a content provider is sending a general title list via the KBART format to the link resolver vendor, and then maybe sending a list of titles via email or via just a list of basic lists of titles by hand to the institution, which then has to convert that into a format that they can upload into the knowledge base. So, of course, people have bright ideas. Why can't we automate this? Can this content provider who's creating a KBART file for the knowledge base vendor also send that to the library so the library will know what it is they've got? So that's the idea with the KBART automation, making it easier for libraries to localize their knowledge base with their own subscriptions. If publishers can simply send files in the KBART format directly to the library for their own subscriptions. So this would be the case where a publisher might, let's say, have a product that contains 50 titles, but the library might subscribe to only 30 of those titles. The library needs to localize the knowledge base. So the idea, this project is just getting started. It's in the first month or two of its discussions, but the idea is to put KBART, which is a text tab delimited format, into a more automatic web format, such as a RESTful web service that allows the KBART data to be introduced in a JSON or XML format for more automation tools. The other piece of this, so we've got one piece where the content provider sends the library its subscriptions in a KBART format, but the idea would be keep the holdings up to date in link resolver, but also perhaps create better tools for counter-analysis. Something that Heather mentioned in her presentation was librarians have always had a desire to get a counter report that tells them what journals are not being used at all. So if you have a list of all of the library's titles and you get a usage list of what titles are being used, then you can compare them and create a list of things that aren't being used at all. That kind of report is difficult for many publishers to produce because publishers, as Heather mentioned, may not be creating counter files that take into account their access control, just the way that they've organized their tools on the back end. But if we can create a KBART report so that a library knows what are my entitlements, then hopefully it should be pretty easy for a library to create or have a tool that creates a munging of the counter report and their KBART file so that then they can see these are the journals which are not being used, and so these are the ones which I'm going to be looking at for my collection evaluation. So that's one potential output from this KBART automation initiative, and there may be others as we come into it, such as managing link resolution or tracking licensing payment details. I think a few vendors have already started doing automated KBART holdings, and one in particular is Elsevier. And Elsevier, Joseph Pollock, who's a technical guy at Elsevier, has been doing presentations about this for at least the last year, so we're lucky he's participating on this initiative. And if your Elsevier customers can already download their entitlements in KBART format, which I understand is a big hit with the Elsevier customers, because I think entitlements from Elsevier can be rather complicated, and this makes managing that information much easier for libraries. So we're hoping to examine Elsevier's process in the KBART automation working group and perhaps make something that's more generalizable for other providers to adopt. The automation working group is a separate group from the standing committee, but it still has all the balance of viewpoints. So we've got content providers, knowledge-based vendors, and librarians, different people, although there is a little bit of overlap. Each of these parties is really quite involved. This is a really energetic group that is discussing how to carry out the charge of creating a recommendation for automating KBART holdings files. Any questions on KBART? Yes. I can hear you.
Okay.
And I'll repeat the question if it's getting recorded.
Okay, so my question, so I've worked with KBART in the past. I'm at EBSCO now, but I was at a scholarly publisher for a long time.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of STEM publishers, for instance, IEEE, AFTM, ASMP, all of those, they have things that don't necessarily work well with KBART, at least the traditional KBART. I don't know if there's updates, but
Uh-huh.
I know Elsevier was banning a bunch of publishers together to try to work through how do you match KBART to standards, to technical documents, to all these things that aren't traditional, but are a very large part of some people's their
Publishing portfolio, yeah.
So is that going to be addressed? Is it already addressed?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you reflect your whole, if you're a publisher and you're publishing things that are not serials or monographs, which are the things that KBART manages, you're publishing sort of weird, we could call them weird things, but you know, that's content too. How do you describe that type of content in a KBART format? That's the question, right? That has not yet been specifically addressed in KBART. However, and I'm not showing the standing committee list here, one of the co-chairs of the standing committee is Kathy Marcaccio from Cengage, and Cengage has a lot of weird stuff that they are communicating to their customers. So that is one of her key things, and I think that might be another way to move in the future. They would be, yeah, definitely. I mean, it hasn't, like I said, it hasn't gotten addressed yet, but when it does, that will definitely. How do you know what you're describing unless you're talking to the publishers of the weird stuff? So, yeah. So the answer is no, not yet, but in the future.
So will that be marketed, broadcast?
Yeah. If that gets going, it would definitely be communicated to as many places as we could find. I'd be interested, maybe we can talk later about that group you mentioned, the sort of stealth group or whatever you called it, to reach out to that.
Give you the names, maybe
Yeah.
you know some of them.
Yeah, good, thanks. Anyone else? All right, good. So I've just got a few minutes to talk quickly about PyJ. And PyJ, as I said, KBART is sort of the back end of publishing journals, and PyJ is more for end user access to e-journal information, in particular when a user is coming from a citation. So when you've got an article that the user is reading, and maybe they're not reading it online, maybe they've got it printed out, or it's an article that was before the days of DOIs, and they're trying to access a particular citation, and they go to the publisher website. How can they find what they're looking for? So PyJ is a very short recommendation. The recommendation itself is only about, I don't know, 4 or 5 pages, would you say? And then it's got a huge bibliography of examples. This working group spent a lot of time putting together examples of good behavior so that other publishers could copy from each other on how to do things like specify their journal titles and citation information, title changes and title history. This is a particular, could say, bugaboo for libraries when a title changes. How do you find the old titles? using the ISSN, the serial number, and numbering things, and general presentation of content to make it consistent and recognizable for an end user. And I've got just a few examples from Taylor and Francis. One of the staff of Taylor and Francis was on the working group and standing committee for PIJ for quite some time. And this is from a presentation that he did. So I've got just a few of the examples of the recommendations, and then how Taylor and Francis carried it out or wasn't able to carry it out. PIJ group recognizes that not all of the recommendations may be easy for a publisher to carry out quickly, given a publisher's back-end processes, information they have on hand, capabilities, and so on. But the idea is that hopefully with enough communication, a publisher would at least start moving in the right direction for future development, given that organizing your website is probably not a very small task for anyone. So these are just a few of the recommendations. These are not all of the PIJ recommendations. But for example, recommendation 2.1.1 says provide the full journal title in a prominent, clear, and consistent manner on every page over which you have control. So we have examples from Taylor and Francis, the Journal of Genetic Psychology. It's consistent on each level of the journal webpage for a user to recognize, yes, I'm at this particular journal, and I'm always going to be looking at this section of the page for this title. I know where I am. Another recommendation, and this is kind of a big deal for libraries which are tracking all of their content, provide a journal title history. Include the full journal title, publication date range, and ISSN for the current title, and at least the immediately preceding or succeeding titles as appropriate. So libraries recognize that it's not unusual for publishers to change journal titles to make journals more relevant to changing audiences, but it is very important to provide linkages between these journal titles so that users can access older information, and librarians can also ensure that they are receiving all of that information. So in this case, we have an older title. I believe this is the older title. Yes, in 1953, the Journal of Genetic Psychology was called the Pedagogical Seminary and Journal of Genetic Psychology. And these things are linked on the Taylor and Francis website. Number 272 says digitize all available content even when it is incomplete, but clearly indicate what is missing. And in the notes for this, Taylor and Francis had admitted that it, at least several years ago, was not quite up to par on this particular recommendation, but it recognized that and was trying to make it as clear as possible about what kind of information was not there. So these are just a few of the PIJ recommendations, and Lori, who's going to be following me, will be talking about how PIJ is being incorporated in another recommendation from yet another organization. But that's it for my slides. Wonder if anyone has any questions either about KBART or PIJ.